Do you see my presentation?
Yes.
Yes, nice. Thank you so much. So today we will talk about sexual violence as a war weapon. Basically, I will trace the way from the idea that sexual violence was inevitable product of war or byproduct of war to the concept of sexual violence as a weapon or instrument of war, meaning sexual violence as an intended policy, not just inevitable byproduct. So, as a historian of different wars, I know that sexual violence, and feminist scholars underline that sexual violence took place in different wars, in different times, in modern world. But today I will start with the Second World War, because the cases of sexual violence were huge, and they were perpetrated by different armies, including those who belong to victors of the Second World War and those who belong to perpetrators, those defeated armies. So first of all, I want to draw your attention to the sexual violence perpetrated by Red Army soldiers during the Second World War, known in public discourse, in media discourse, as a rape, political discourse, as a rape of Germany. So we know that in spring 1945, Soviet troops reached Berlin, and the siege of the capital of the Third Reich back then started. You see from those pictures that it was devastating situation, it was lack of electricity, damaged infrastructure, lack of medication, clean water, and civilian population suffered the most. The city officially surrendered on the 2nd May, but on 8th May, it was agreement that Germany capitulates. That's why in Europe, the 8th May is a day of remembrance, while in post-Soviet space in some countries like Russia and Belarus, 9 May is a day of so-called victory, Великая Победа, the great victory. But during celebration of this great victory, many memory agents avoid to talk about crimes, war crimes, and crimes against humanity perpetrated by Red Army. Among those crimes, the prominent outstanding role belonged to sexual crimes. It is estimated that at least 2 million women in German Eastern territories were raped by Red Army soldiers, and among them, 100,000 belong to Berlin only. 10,000 women perished as a result of rape in Germany, as a result of killing. Some were killed after the rape or while trying to resist rape. Some of them took their lives. Thousands of women seek abortions. Approximately 300,000 children were fathered by Soviet soldiers, but some of them experienced ostracism, social pressure, stigmatization. Some people call them Russian bastard, Russian brat, and other derogatory terms applied to them. So it's very important to remember that children born of war were also can be considered also as victims of wartime rape. Today, today exists some agreement among scholars of the Second World War and feminist scholars that the main motive of Red Army soldiers was revenge. As Norman Naimark pointed out, so soldiers sought revenge from Germans for what they had done to their homeland, to their towns and villages, and to their families, including extensive crimes of rape. I recommend you the book of German prominent outstanding feminist scholar Regina Mühlhäuser, who described different types of sexual violence perpetrated by German soldiers and their allies and their helpers on the Eastern territories, including Ukraine, Russia, and other territories. We know from different testimonies of survivors and from current studies, like study of Edward Westermann, I recommend you book Drunk on Genocide, that alcohol was a facilitator and is still a facilitator in many cases of sexual violence. The Anonyma, in her diary, Eine Frau in Berlin, pointed out, I am convinced that if the Russians, meaning in this way, meaning Soviet soldiers, hadn't found so much alcohol all over, half as many rapes would have taken place. Actually, you see her here, Anonyma, the author of this prominent diary about mass rapes in Berlin from April to June 1945. Her real name was Martha Hillers, revealed later by some journalists, but she published her book first in English in 1953 in the United States. When she published her book in 1985 in Germany, it provokes a huge discussion. Some of people say she insults the honor of German women. Some of the people blamed her for her survival strategy because she decided to use her body as a tool of survivor. She picked up one of the Soviet officer just to avoid sexual humiliation from other soldiers and other officers. We know that many women in war conditions, in different war, in Congo, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and other war contexts, they pick the same survival strategy. This book was republished in 2003, and the bigger discussion started about meaning of sexual violence, about motives of motivation of perpetrators, and about consequences, immediate and long-term, on women and other witnesses of sexual violence. The prominent role sexual violence also played during the Holocaust. For a long time, it was overshadowed and it was underrepresented in the hegemonic narrative of the Holocaust. Why? One of the reasons is the rape myth. When people thought that German racial laws prevented Germans, especially members of elite SS groups, of perpetrating of violence, of humiliating Jewish women because of Rassenschande. Many scholars downplayed sexual violence. They were reluctant to even address this question during their field work, during the conversations with Holocaust survivors. Some of them really saw that they harmed those women while asking these questions. But very important role when we are talking about sexual violence plays actually the issue. Whose sufferings actually we remember, whose harm matters for us. So other reason that prevented women from speaking up, and the men as well, was social and cultural reasons, meaning this, idea that social violence belonged to private sphere. We shouldn't talk about this. It's about it's covered with, privacy and so on and so on. Some women really avoid talking about their sexual victimization because they're afraid that their men will abandon them, will divorce with them. And we have those cases after the Second World War. We have cases when men showed this underestimation of sufferings of their loved ones. Also, political reasons played role. We know, and I will talk about this later, that Nuremberg Tribunal displayed, underestimated actually, and marginalized the topic of sexual violence, and nobody was charged with sexual violence. And of course, personal reasons behind silence. Survivors didn't want to harm their beloved ones, didn't want to disclose this sensitive information to their children, to their relatives. They wanted to present themselves as heroes during the Holocaust, as survivors, those who had agency. They were trying to avoid stigma, hierarchy of losses, and victim blaming. But today we know that during sexual violence, during the Holocaust, sexual violence had variety of forms, including forcing to watch sexual violence, assaults of other people, forced nudity, sexual slavery, sexualized torture, forced penetration with objects, forced sterilization, forced abortion, forced prostitution, castration, and genital mutilation. Many women were victimized in concentration camps. We know from testimonies of Holocaust survivors that after just entering and undergoing those sanitary procedures, women experienced shame and humiliation because those who performed those procedures were mostly men. They performed gynecological searches because they really believe that every single Jewish woman has some valuable, some gold inside her body. They experience shaving their heads as a sexual humiliation, as a threat to their womanhood, to their self-perception as women. Women suffered from the absence of basic sanitary products, which also harmed their femininity. Those who experience absence of menstruation develop a fear that they will never become a mother. We know that Nazis established more than 500 brothels across occupied Europe. Some of them were in concentration camps like Auschwitz, Flossenburg, Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. 2 years ago, I visited Dachau, and our guide actually told us a story about this brothel. So I recommend you, if you will visit Dachau, please ask your guide about this issue. More than 34,000 girls and women were trafficked and raped at the sites, mostly by German soldiers and Nazi police. The brothels played the role of reward, first of all, for forced laborers and prison leaders, and the cruel mechanism to attempt to cure gay men who were forced to make compulsory visits. We know that many gay men were, thousands actually were arrested by Nazis and were placed in different concentration camps. And the survival rate among gay men was much lower than the survival rate, for example, among political prisoners or among criminal prisoners. I'm not taking into consideration nowadays Roma and Jewish people. Of course, Jewish people, the rate of survival was the lowest. Sexual violence took different forms during the Holocaust, and one of these violence was pure genocidal violence. This genocidal violence, the example of genocidal violence, is the assault on motherhood. We know that in nationalistic narratives and Nazi narratives as well, women's bodies always presented as the carriers of nation, as a nation itself. They reproduce nation in biological way by giving a life to new members of nation, and they reproduce nation culturally by upbringing in a national conscious way. That's why Jewish women and Jewish women's bodies and bodies of mothers and potential mothers were the main targets for Nazis. We know that those people from racially mixed couples were targeted Sinti and Roma people, LGBT. Many women underwent forced abortions. They experienced medical experiments on their reproductive organs, which took place via radiation, injections, and surgery. They were poorly performed and often injured or killed the women, the persons who were involved. But sexual violence by Germans and their allies and local perpetrators took place in whole Nazi-occupied territories, including Ukraine and other territories in Eastern Europe. Those incidents of sexual violence were perpetrated in many cases by local men. For example, those who belonged to different units who collaborated with Nazis. For example, members of auxiliary police or members of local administrations. And we know, for example, that some women were forced basically to negotiate with guards in ghettos like Kamenets-Podolsk ghetto, when women were not allowed to go outside the ghetto in order to find some food for them and their loved ones. That's why, for example, I put example of Kamenets-Podolsk ghetto, when women asked Tchaikovsky, one of the policemen, Ukraine guy, who forced them to have sexual intercourse with him, just to make them go outside the ghetto. And here is the testimony of survivor of this ghetto, Clara, who listed the names of those young Jewish girls, Vasya, Donya, Hanka, and other women who cried because of that fact, but couldn't do nothing. So on the one hand, we see some agency of women, but on the other hand, we see this crucial disparity of power when some women took advantage of their power position during the Holocaust. We know that some members of police, different police units, when they found out that some Jewish girls were hiding using false documents and pretending to be, pretending to be Ukrainians or pretending to be Belarusians or Russians or Poles, they blackmailed them. For example, it's very prominent in this context is the story of Rina. She lived in Lviv before the war, and during the Holocaust, she pretended to be a Pole girl. She was separated with her mother, who was hiding in another place. But one day, Polish guy, member of Kripo police, said to her, "I know everything," and he forced her to have sexual intercourse with him. She was very young. Underage Jewish girl. It was very traumatic experience for her, like for many Jewish girls. In many cases, sexual violence was the first actually experience of sexual nature for many women. We know that even those women in hiding were constant targets of sexual violence by different people, including those aid givers who abused their power, including members of different partisan units, for example, in Ukraine forest, where we had Soviet partisans, nationalist partisans, Polish partisans, Jewish partisans. For example, here I place the testimony of Gita, who were trying to survive together with her husband Abram in Ternopil Oblast, in the forest. And she was raped in front of her husband by one of the members of Ukraine Nationalist Partisan Unit. She called him, of course, Banderevets. What is important that harm, this gendered harm of those women was forgotten. They didn't get justice. Despite the fact that Nuremberg tribunals recorded numerous cases of sexual victimization of Jewish women, sexual violence was not included in the Charter of the International Military Tribunal, Article 6, which provided definition of the newly established concept, crimes against humanity. Why? Because it was political reason. Soviet Union wasn't happy, actually, with bringing to light sex crimes perpetrated by Soviets. US Army also committed different crimes. Approximately, nowadays we know about 16,000 incidents of crimes committed by U.S. Army. So different actors involved in this transitional post-war justice were not interested in prosecuting perpetrators. Some of them relied on national courts, and one of the leader in this persecution, I believe, was Soviet Union. They established some legal framework of persecution of Nazis and their local collaborators, but they never actually mentioned the sexual violence as a war crime. Despite this fact, there were numerous show trials, for example, like this trial trial of Grigory Andrusiv. He was chief of the local auxiliary police in Vinnytsia region, in Bar precisely, and he was involved in Holocaust in this locality. And you see this show trial attended, numerous people at that time, and one of the most prominent witness in this trial was Clara. You see her on the killing side. She's pointing out on graves where her family members and neighbors and acquaintances and classmates were killed by Nazis. At that night, at that day in October 1942, she, among other girls, was picked up by assessment, and Andrusiv himself, they were brought to the building of police in the city center, and all of them were raped during this celebration, in quoting marks, of killing Jews by assessment, German policemen and Ukraine policemen, local policemen. She was only survivor of this mass rape, and she gave her testimony during this trial, and she asked to punish Grigory Andrusiv by death. And she was basically the voice of those women, of those young girls who were silenced by death. The first feminist discourse about sexual violence in war actually appeared during the second wave of feminism. Susan Brown Miller, a prominent American feminist of the second wave of feminism, and she is still alive and she is still vocal and still productive, published her book Against Our Will, when she expressed the main point that rape is integral to legitimizing patriarchy. So her point was that rape and sexual violence is a tool of patriarchy used by every man to keep women in fear in order to control them, to establish control over their life, over their bodies. We know that sexual violence didn't stop with the Second World War. In this slide, I show you how many cases of sexual violence were present in different conflicts in 70s, 80s, 90s, in Chile, Guatemala, Peru, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Cambodia, India, in Africa region, in Sudan, Liberia, Angola, and so on and so on. Organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch were trying to document all those cases, and as well United Nations. The widespread patterns of rape during this war was rape used by government security forces against guerrilla groups, sexualized torture, genital mutilation, sexual slavery, forced recruitment, forced marriages of women and girls in combat units. We know that thousands of women suffered sexual violence during genocide in Rwanda. Most of them were Tutsi women. Human Rights Watch presented a report on the use of sexual violence in 1996, emphasizing that the build-up to the genocide political propaganda played on sexual stereotypes of Tutsi women, which contributed to the widespread sexual violence during war, which had different forms, including sexual slavery and forced impregnement. most horrific cases, one of the most horrific cases of sexual violence took place in former Yugoslavia. And we don't have exact numbers. Of course, it's difficult to estimate them, but different organizations show that thousands of women actually suffered sexual violence during war in former Yugoslavia, and this sexual violence appeared in different public spaces and private spaces and had different patterns and different forms. For example, it occurred with looting and intimidation before even the outbreak of this war, then occurred during fighting, then in detention facilities. We know several rape camps, and I want to point out that today some of them are turned to the hotels, to spa centers, and there is no any evidence even presented to public that women suffered there, that women took life there, that women were forcibly pregnant, or they contracted venereal diseases, they were beaten and humiliated. In so-called bordello camps, women were held in these camps to provide sex for men returning from the front lines, while many of the women of the camps were eventually exchanged for other civilian prisoners. Those women were generally killed. We know that one of the widespread pattern of violence was what Siobhan Fisher called the occupation of womb. She meant this forced impregnating of Muslim women by Serbian soldiers. Serbian captors told women that they were trying to impregnate them. In so doing, they would create Chetnik babies who would kill Muslims when they grew up. Furthermore, they repeatedly said that the president had ordered them to do this. We know that in 1993 was established International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, and the next year for former Rwanda. And during many years, those tribunals were trying to establish, document, and different cases of sexual violence. And so far, we know that, for example, ICTI has indicted 161 persons, and 58 of them were charged with sexual violence, while in case of Rwanda, we have numbers 93 and 35 of them were charged with sexual violence. So nowadays, after these, after these massive sex crimes in Rwanda and Yugoslavia, we had established this concept as a rape as weapon of war, instrument of war. It's not a legal concept, but it has taken a legal significance with efforts by Rwanda and Yugoslav tribunals. Rapes in both conflicts are most often charged as crimes against humanity or crimes of genocide. And common terms, which is widespread in scholarly discourse, are instrument of genocide, engine of war, war tactic, war instrument, and so on and so forth. So the main idea that rape and sexual violence is not just byproduct of war. It's not perpetrated out of some, a particular interest of particular soldiers. Rape has a function to humiliate, to terrorize, to extract information, to spread the fear, to send a message to the enemy men, and so on. So persecuting rape as a crime against humanity requires showing that act of rape took place as a part of a widespread or systematic attack against civilian population on national, political, ethnic, racial, or religious ground. So rape basically is not just crime against one person perpetrated by other person. it's a crime against collectivity, because women are raped not only because of their gender, but because of their identity and belonging to some groups. But what are constraints and limitation of this theory, of this concept as a rape of weapon of war? It's very vivid in terms of war in former Yugoslavia, when UN, for example, insisted in, Serbs perpetrators and Muslim victims. So it was created some binary opposition when only Muslim women were survivors and only Serb men were perpetrators. The person who supported this was American lawyer, American legal scholar Catherine McKinnon. She described this violence as genocidal, systematic, organized, and so on. And she developed the theory that pornography, together with Andrea Dworkin, that pornography, of course, contributed to this. But criticism of understanding of genocidal rape is too focused on ethnicity and war. So some researchers, some activists said, whereas Serb women who were victimized, why their sufferings are overshadowed? Because they are wives, sisters, and daughters of aggressors? That's why their humiliation doesn't matter? That's why we are not grieving with them? Rhonda Copeland developed this idea, another American scholar, and she placed the question, is genocidal rape exceptional? Why we are trying to operate by definitions introduced by perpetrators? Maybe those women, not every woman actually referred to the image of, Muslim or Serb or nowadays Ukraine or Russian woman. Maybe her identity was different. So we are trying to establish a rape gaze actually. At the same time, this concept of genocidal rape could actually create this hierarchy of victims, as I said previously, and underestimation of intra-ethnic rape, underestimation of domestic violence, for example, as a product of war inside all societies who belong to them, who are fighting actually. We underestimate so-called normal rape, meaning rape in peacetime. So we are trying to present genocidal rape as something exceptional, something that creates more damage than, for example, rape by your partner, intimate partner, marriage rape, or rape during, some visiting some nightclubs and so on, so on. So this controversy is still in place. And nowadays, so we have established 3 different readings of rape in general. It's a simplification, but I want to bring those ideas. So gendered or patriarchal, expressed by Susan Brown Miller. Rape as an instrument of terror of women, actually, by men. National, rape can become a symbol of one nation's dominance over another, which we have actually nowadays in terms of Russian aggression against Ukraine, and ethnic, to assert supremacy by one ethnic group over another, when, for example, we have cases of inter-ethnic violence. But we should remember that in almost all wars and genocides, we have different cases of sexual violence. We have opportunistic rape committed for private individual reasons. We have rape as practice, when it is not ordered, but it is tolerated. And the rape as strategy, meaning rape as a weapon of war. And last point, what next? Next, we should take a closer look on Ukraine and on behavior of Russian military in Ukraine. So far, we have 248 cases of rape. And as you see, among them, we have certain children. But please remember, those numbers concerns only those people who are ready to fight for justice. Those numbers are provided by Office of General Prosecutor of Ukraine, and it's only the top of the iceberg. Because for different reasons, women are not reporting. 18% of Ukraine territory is still occupied by Russians, so we don't have access to those who suffered sexual violence. We know that some women in liberated territories are reluctant to talk about their experience for different reasons. One of them, they're afraid that Russians will come back and will punish them for disclosure information about them. Russian military in Ukraine nowadays use different forms of sexual violence. You see them here. Among those who are victimized, we have small children. The youngest child experienced rape by Russian soldiers is 4-year-old, but most of the cases of child abuse we see in Bucha. Among them is 9-year-old girl who was violated by 7 different men. But what is very important, nowadays I'm trying to deal with sexual violence against men and boys in this war Russia against Ukraine, and to my knowledge we will have even bigger number of male survivors and victims than women. Why? Because we nowadays, thousands of men, military and civilian, are in Russian captivity. Of course we have women as well, but mostly men. And we know that in captivity, in every single war, we have the highest rate of sexual torture, sexualized violence, and so on. So I believe those numbers will be much, much higher. For example, even today, we know that, for example, in this infamous colony Olenivka in Donetsk Oblast, we from testimonies we know that male inmates were subjected to different forms of sexual violence. Among them, according to data from Office of Prosecutor General, only those 2 men that are portrayed here are charged with victimization of 100 Ukraine servicemen. UN reports many cases of sexualized violence when Russian soldiers just humiliated and introduced sexual torture just for fun, to enforce their power and to humiliate Ukraine soldiers. So I believe that in many cases we are dealing with genocidal rape, and we are dealing with the sexual violence used by Russian military as a weapon. Why? Because please pay attention to the genocidal language of Russian propagandists, Russian media, Russian politicians, and all involved in justification of Russian aggression against Ukraine. Many women who were violated were blamed to be Nazi sluts or Bandera sluts. And while raping, for example, pregnant women in Ukraine, they were told that Russians want to just erase these Bandera bastards from their body. We know that many instances of rape are publicly known. Why? One of the reasons, Russian soldiers are trying to boast, to show their rape. So when this guy who is alleged with castration of Ukrainian soldier and then killing him, this Russian military man, after killing these castrated Ukraine military men, this video was actually disseminated among, was put on Telegram channels controlled by Russian state. So basically, it was deliberate policy to intimidate Ukraine men, to demoralize them, to undermine their masculinity on the one hand, and on the other hand, to to express, to reinforce, to enforce masculinity of Russian men. We know that Russia experienced some problems with mobilization. That's why we know that some soldiers are allowed to rape women in occupied territory as a means of reward, just to keep their morale, to keep them fighting. We know that some soldiers used even Viagra, during perpetration of rape, and they were given this by their commanders. From testimonies of survivors and witnesses, we know that some Russian soldiers were not prevented from committing rape. And in some cases, this rape was organized and instigated, orchestrated by their commanders. In many cases, during interrogation, commanders threat women and men by gun rape of their subordinates. And we know that those perpetrators, for example, like 64th Motor Rifle Brigade in Russia, are celebrated as heroes, as fighters with so-called Nazis in Ukraine. They are not punished for their deeds. They are celebrated, like Red Army soldiers were celebrated despite their involvement in massive sex crimes. One of the reasons why I believe the sex crimes are used by deliberate tactic of war against Ukraine is a constant denial. Spokesperson of Putin constantly repeat, it's a lie. We don't have evidence about sexual crimes. Everything is a lie. Ukraine's a lying, Russian soldiers who disclose information to their, relatives and peers are lying. International human rights organizations are lying. Everyone is lying, and Russian politicians express this idea on every single possible stage, including UN sphere, UN sessions. So I encourage you to read my last article, Weapon of War, Sexual Violence of Russian military during the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Thank you so much for your attention. I would be happy to reply to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marta. It was really great intervention in the topic, and absolutely impressed with the scale and the scale of the issue, and that hundreds of years of wars doesn't change the behavior and patriarchal pattern of militarism and the war. The floor is open. So if you have a question, the recording is stopped. So if you have a question, please take a floor or write them down into the chat. Yes, we have a question. Please, Alexandra, then Salome, and then Diana. Please, Alexandra.
Hi, do you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for the lecture. It was really interesting, but quite shocking, but still is shocking how it's normal can be. So my question was, at least like it started, my question started in the first part of the lecture. Like from the first slides, I have a question about what we can do at like what is it even can be stopped? Is it not something that biologically, something like, biological theory, is it even can be stopped? Can we do something? Will it be end, like will it have some ending? And also I have two questions, but it's about it's a little bit another part, so I will ask them after they answer.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, it's a question that is debated by so many people nowadays, different activists, human rights activists, first of all, and of course, different feminist organizations, because it's the most important question now, how to stop, how to prevent, how to develop survivor-centered approach and help all survivors and their loved ones. So as Elizabeth Wood showed up in her different studies, she studied different conflicts, and she understood that not every army is involved in massive sex crimes. So it could be actually, it could be prevented. It could be, we shouldn't tolerate this. But in order to prevent this, and in order to stop this, we should develop some preventive mechanism. We should fight against misogyny and patriarchy. We should fight against the sexist attitudes toward women, first of all, because patriarchy plays a huge role. We should develop all policy that, help us to designate if we could expect some, incidents of rape. For example, some red flags. For example, when we have looting, when we have tortures, when we have mass killings of civilian population in war zone, we should expect sexual violence. Because sexual violence is a part only of this, wide range of instruments of terror established by armies. And another preventive mechanism is justice. Justice is one of the most important things. That's why today Ukraine is relying not only on this, international tribunal, but also on national trials. For example, today I'm involved in helping one of the survivor from Ukraine. She is now in Germany, and my friends, lawyers and feminist activists are trying to help her